Today's Talk About It Tuesday question is, I'm considering buying a rental property. I know it can be profitable, but I worry about managing tenants. I don't know what to expect. Do you have any landlord tenant horror stories? Whew. Okay, so let me say this. I bought my first rental property in 1996. So I have nearly 30 years of stories that I can share. Most of them great stories, but I do have a few horror stories that I'll share. Now, let me say this. I have no regrets at all about becoming a landlord, and I would never discourage anybody from becoming a landlord, but I do want you to know some things you can expect. Now, the biggest horror story, I think, for any landlord is when, for one reason or another, a tenant doesn't pay the rent, right? Either they're unable or they're unwilling to pay the rent. And in a state like New York, where it is very tenant friendly, going to court to get someone removed for non-payment can take between 1 and 2 years. And in that time, you're not getting payment and they're staying in your place for free while the court proceedings go on. So that is probably the worst thing that can happen to you as a landlord, someone staying in your place for free and you having to fight to get them out of your place. So a lot of landlords here tend to pay people to leave, which is insane because the amounts they have to pay to get someone to leave is crazy. But that's not the horror story I want to share. Of course, I've been through that, but that's common. Everybody knows that. But let me share 2 reasons why that I think are comical, 2 reasons why people chose not to pay. So the first one, and this is back in the days before we had the electronic payments when you used to have to actually go and collect rent. So I knock on the door to collect the rent, first of the month. I'm expected. And my tenant answered the door and she said, I'm not paying. I said, why are you not paying? She said, I looked under the sink. I opened the cabinet under the sink and I saw a crack in the back and bugs could come through there. And I said, whoa, well, did you see any bugs? She said, no, I didn't see any bugs, but bugs could come through there. And as long as that crack is there, I'm not paying. I said, so wait a minute. You found a crack that you believe a bug could come through, but you saw no bugs. No, I didn't see any bugs. And you're telling me you're not paying. Yes, I'm not paying because there's a crack in there. I thought that was hilarious. But obviously that was the excuse because she didn't have the money and she tried to delay. And eventually I had to take her to court and remove her because it wasn't about the crack, because I fixed the crack, I think like the next day or something like that, filled in a crack. So anyway, I thought that was kind of ridiculous. That's a horror story. But I had another one where these 2 ladies were best friends. And these are not young. I mean, when I say 2 ladies who were best friends, these were middle-aged ladies. These women were in their 40s, best friends, took the apartment together, split the rent in half. I don't know what happened, but after a few months, they were not best friends anymore, and they were fighting like cats and dogs, and even had to call the police on each other because it got extremely violent. Eventually, one of them found another apartment because she couldn't stay with her anymore because it was too volatile, and she actually moved out. So that's not my problem. I come to collect the rent at the beginning of the next month when there's only one person there, and she tried to hand me half the rent. And I said, well, where's the other half? She said, well, I only pay half the rent. So-and-so used to pay the other half. I said, but you have the whole apartment now. She could not understand that she had to pay the full rent because both of them were on the lease. They're both, whoever's there is responsible for the rent. And just because she left doesn't mean you get a whole apartment for half the rent. So those are some kind of strange reasons why people choose not to pay rent. But again, eventually had to take her to court, and that was that. But I had some other really strange things happen. So I had a young man. It was his first apartment, and I don't know, we got to talking. I don't know how the subject came up, but he told me that he runs the shower, the hot water in the shower, for at least a half an hour before he gets in. I said, you do what? He said, yeah, I like it really steamy in the bathroom. I like that effect, like it's really steamy. I said, so you're running hot water for a half an hour just to get steam in the bathroom? I lost my mind. He didn't understand that hot water is not free. He didn't understand water is not free. But hot water is even more expensive than cold water because you have to pay the fuel bill to heat the hot water. He could not understand that, and I almost lost my mind. So that was kind of crazy. And heat is always crazy. Here in New York, it's cold for most of the year, so you have to provide heat. Landlords are responsible for providing heat in New York. And for some reason, people who don't have to pay the heating bill think that it's supposed to feel like summertime in their apartment in the winter. So always had an issue with tenants saying, and here's the mistake I made in the beginning. I used to let the tenants control the heat. And then I would go over there and the heat is up at 80 degrees, 85 degrees, which is ridiculous because if it was 85 degrees in the summer, you'd be mad you'd put the air conditioner on, right? So they would put the heat at 80, 85 degrees. And so I denied access to them and I put it on a timer. And I would put a lockbox on it. They learned how to pick that lock, and that heat would be up at 80 to 90 degrees. Also, I've had tenants, when I had allowed them to control it, would put the heat on when they were not home because they like to come home to a warm apartment. So they, in the morning before going to work, would put the heat on in their apartment, be gone for 8 hours in an empty apartment that's getting heated, and they would turn it all the way up, so they could come home and it was already toasty in the apartment, not understanding how that would drive up the heating bill. So that was always the problem. And then when I started controlling it, I would get phone calls. It's too cold in here. And I'm like, well, it doesn't make sense because I have it on a timer. But let me go and check it out. So I would go there, knock on the tenant's apartment who called to complain that they were cold. And they would be in shorts and a T-shirt in the wintertime talking about they're cold. I was like, you're not dressed for the winter. Why do you think? And the temperature would be hot. It'd be 70 something, 72, 73 degrees, which is comfortable if you have on clothes. But they wanted it to feel, they said, why should I be in my apartment at home uncomfortable? You don't have to be uncomfortable, but you have to dress for the winter in New York. So heat was always an issue. Another thing, twice I discovered I had hoarders. So, and this is how you generally discover it. You say, well, you want to inspect the apartment. They're never available to allow you to inspect the apartment. Boy, you need to make a repair. And they're never available to make the repair. They're always, something always comes up every time. And that's happened to me twice. And once it was like, listen, this is an emergency repair. We have to come in. Came in the apartment and could not believe, because the where you first come in, where the living room and the kitchen are, they didn't hoard in there. Their bedroom was stacked floor to ceiling with everything you could imagine. And so they tried to claim to me that, and this was years after they moved in, that they just never unpacked the stuff from when they moved. I said, fine. So listen, I'm going to get somebody to clean the place out. Because to me, that's a fire hazard, it's a rodent hazard, it's a death trap. So I paid for a professional cleaner to come and clean it out. And believe it or not, they allowed me to do it, which was strange, I guess, for a hoarder. Within a few months, the place was full back up again. So I knew it had nothing to do with bringing old stuff from the old apartment. So had that. Then I had another tenant. He would never let me in the apartment, and eventually stopped paying rent, and I was able to remove him. And when I went to the apartment, I could not believe it was hoarding from floor to ceiling in every room. It was insane. So I had hoarders. And I guess the last horror story, I had a guy, it's usually young guys that are the worst, right? I had this young guy, and now this was in a 4-story building. I had a 4-story building, and he was on the 3rd floor. He had a 3rd floor apartment. And he had company, had friends over, and they got drunk, but he was supposed to be cooking for them. And he fell asleep with the stove on, which shouldn't really be a problem, right? Except that it triggered the sprinkler system. And the sprinkler system from the 3rd floor, it triggered the sprinkler doesn't go off until the fire department comes and shuts it off. So while he was sleeping, not only did the smoke detector go off, but the sprinkler system went off and flooded from the 3rd floor down to the 1st floor. The ceilings below him fell from all the water. And talk about a horror story. In my era, I had transferred the building to an LLC for asset protection, right? Smart me, but I didn't change the insurance. So the insurance company didn't recognize the claim because now the property was in an LLC and I didn't transfer the insurance to the LLC. The insurance was still in my name. So the insurance refused to pay. So I had 3 floors of damage from this guy falling asleep drunk while he was cooking, and I had to pay for the whole thing, all the repairs for 3 floors by myself. So those are some horror stories. They're not really that bad. So like I said, I regret not a single moment of being a landlord. I think is 100% worth it, even though there will be times when you'll run into a crazy tenant who hoards, or somebody who does something, luckily it didn't cause a real fire, or you have, non-payment, whatever it is. You'll run into these hoarders, all kind of stuff every once in a while. But for the majority of the last, almost 30 years that I've been a landlord, it's been positive, it's been profitable, it's been 100% worth it. So if you're considering it, I say go for it, but you will have some stories to tell in 30 years. So I'd love to hear your stories. If you have some real horror stories, please share in the comments, but please like, share, subscribe, keep the questions coming, and I'll see you next Tuesday.